I still remember the sound of the ship's horn. It cut through the humid Miami air like a blade. Sharp, final, and impossible to ignore. My grandfather, Walter Haynes, stood a few feet from the boarding gate, his hand gripping the rail of his walker, his other hand holding an envelope that should have held his boarding pass. But it was empty, just like the look in his eyes. "They said I'm not on the manifest," he whispered. His voice didn't tremble from age, it trembled from something colder. Disbelief. Across the gangway, my father waved impatiently, gesturing for me to hurry. "Jake, come on, they'll leave without us." He didn't even look back at Grandpa. Mom was already on the ship, filming a selfie video for her Instagram story. Something about finally unplugging. My sister was flirting with one of the crew. No one noticed the old man left behind. No one except me. I looked down at Grandpa. His suitcase was small, old-fashioned, the kind with brass buckles. He'd polished it the night before. Said he wanted to look presentable for the Atlantic. He thought this was a family trip, a celebration, a thank you for everything he'd given, everything he'd sacrificed. Instead, it was a transaction, one where he paid, and then was discarded. "I guess I wasn't part of the itinerary," he said quietly, tried to laugh, but it died in his throat. I stepped away from the ramp, from the family that boarded without a word, from the lie we'd all been sold. "I'm not going," I said. He blinked. "Jake, don't. This was your chance to see the world." I shook my head. "Not like this, not if you're not in it." The ship pulled away slowly, the sound of celebration fading behind us, replaced by the echo of a suitcase wheel dragging across pavement, and a silence far louder than any engine roar. We didn't speak much on the ride back. He sat beside me, staring out the window, his reflection looking older than he did yesterday. But I saw something else in his eyes, too. Something quiet, something not broken yet. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a reckoning, for those who mistake generosity for weakness and silence for surrender. The ride back to Charleston was 12 hours. But in my head, it took me further, back to summers that smelled like lemon oil and watch grease. My grandfather's clock repair shop wasn't glamorous. It was a small storefront tucked between a barber and a pawn shop on King Street. No neon sign, no jingle, just a faded wooden plaque that read, "Haynes timepieces, if it ticks, we fix." I was 9 when I first stayed with him for a summer. By day 3, I could tell a quartz from a mechanical just by sound. He taught me that. "Every watch has its own rhythm," he said. "Just like people, learn to listen long enough, and you'll know what's broken without seeing it." He never raised his voice, never rushed, and somehow, without ever saying it out loud, he made me feel like I mattered. Not because I achieved something, but because I simply existed. We used to sit for hours at the workbench, him hunched over tiny gears, me holding the flashlight steady. Sometimes we didn't speak at all, but it wasn't silence. It was peace, the kind you don't notice until you've grown up and realize how loud the world really is. Back home, things were different. Dad ran a financial advisory firm. Mom was all about image, status, appearances. Dinner wasn't dinner unless it was plated right for a photo. And affection, that had to be earned. With grades, internships, resumes, not heart. The older I got, the more I understood that my bond with Grandpa was something my parents never had time or patience for. They called him soft, said he lived in the past. A man out of time, my father once joked, while scrolling through crypto updates. But that so-called man out of time was the one who stood still long enough to teach me how to be human. Even when I moved out for college, Even when I drifted into the noise of adult life, I still came back to the shop whenever I could, sometimes just to sit, sometimes just to hear that old wall clock strike noon. And every time I did, he'd say the same thing. "Welcome home, kiddo. The gears missed you." That's what made what happened at the port so unforgivable. Because they didn't just leave behind an old man. They left behind the only soul who still ran on heartbeats, not profit margins. And now, they'd learn what happens when a silent clockmaker decides it's time to speak. It started like most manipulation does. With flattery and pie, it was early October. The leaves hadn't turned yet, but the invitations had started. A group chat named Family Bonding Cruise. Emoji hearts. Bitmojis in Hawaiian shirts. All curated by my mother. The message was clear. We've been too distant. It's time we traveled together like real families do. Grandpa was hesitant. He said his knees didn't like humidity. And he hadn't been on a boat since the army. But they pressed on. First came the nostalgia. Dad emailed an old photo of Grandpa holding me as a baby at the beach. "Still remember this day, Pop," he wrote. "Let's make new memories." Then came the guilt. Mom added, "It would mean the world to us. You've missed so many milestones. Let this be your legacy trip." A legacy. That word always meant something different in our family. It wasn't about stories or love. It was about money, control, image. Still, Grandpa looked hopeful. He printed the photo, put it on the fridge. I watched him fold laundry twice that week. Even though he wears the same 3 button-ups, he polished his shoes. He bought seasickness bands just in case. Then, 3 nights before the booking deadline, the request came. We were all gathered at my parents' house. A rare dinner with cloth napkins and vintage wine, too formal for a casual cruise talk. "Dad," my father began, swirling his glass. "We've done the math, and we're nearly set. Everyone's chipped in what they could, but we're short on the deposit." Grandpa paused mid-bite. "How much?" he asked. "Only 25, my mother jumped in quickly. 1,000, that is, but that covers everyone's fare. 4 cabins, balcony suites, airfare included." She said it like it was nothing. Like 25,000 was a family contribution, not a full payment. I looked around. My sister sipped her wine. Her husband checked fantasy football on his phone. No one blinked. No one said, "We'll split it later." No one even offered to pitch in more. Just silence. And the soft clink of cutlery. Grandpa nodded slowly. "If it brings everyone together." His voice trailed off. I opened my mouth, closed it, because he was smiling, not with his face, but with that buried, flickering hope. That maybe, just maybe, they finally wanted him there. For who he was, not what he gave. He wrote the check the next morning. I found it on the table beside a note that said, "Can't wait to make memories with my family." And I wish, God, I wish, that memory had stayed what it was supposed to be. But now I know. They didn't invite him to belong. They invited him to fund. The morning of the cruise was pure chaos, the kind my mother called vacation excitement, and my grandfather called bad luck brewing. The shuttle to the port arrived 20 minutes late. My father barked at the driver. My sister complained about humidity, and Grandpa, he sat quietly in the front seat, hands folded over his lap, wearing his pressed linen shirt and old captain's hat. "I figured it was appropriate," he said to me with a wink. I smiled, but something inside me was already bracing. At the port, things moved fast. Too fast. Dad led the way, holding a manila envelope with all the passports. Mom followed, coordinating with a cruise rep named Brian, who looked like he hated his job more than we hated traffic. Grandpa stood beside me, clutching his small suitcase, the same one he brought on army leave in 1967. Then I saw it. The flicker, Dad's body tensed as the clerk typed, then whispered something, more typing, more frowns. I stepped closer. What's wrong? Dad turned, tone too casual. Nothing major, just a minor error. Looks like there's no record of Grandpa's reservation. What? I said, louder than I meant. It's probably just a glitch, he added. These systems, you know how they are. Brian shook his head. No booking under Walter Haynes. Not even a wait list. Grandpa blinked, but the check. Dad cut him off. It must not have gone through the agent properly. We'll fix it. But timing's tight. They're closing boarding soon. Mom stepped in, voice syrupy. Dad, it's okay. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise. The ship is huge. Your knees aren't what they used to be. You said elevators make you dizzy. Wait, Grandpa said softly. I paid for this. You paid for us to go, my father corrected gently. And we're going. You should rest. We'll bring back photos. Then, he turned just like that and walked toward the ramp. Without a backward glance, I stood frozen. The air felt heavier than it should have, like the humidity had turned into gravity. Grandpa didn't cry, didn't shout. He just stared at the departing line, then looked at me, eyes still. They forgot me, he said, not bitter, just hollow. I reached for his suitcase, then his arm. They didn't forget, I said. They just hoped you wouldn't notice. He hesitated. Jake, you've wanted this trip for years. I shook my head. I didn't want the ocean. I wanted us. So while my family boarded a ship funded by lies, I walked Grandpa back to the taxi stand. The port music faded behind us, but in its place was a vow I didn't speak out loud. You don't leave people like luggage. Not when they built the dock you're standing on. The cruise lasted 2 weeks, 4 countries, 6 ports, hundreds of selfies. None of them included Grandpa. Back in Charleston, he didn't say much, didn't complain, didn't speak of the port. He just returned to the shop, flipped the sign to open, and began repairing a grandfather clock, as if nothing had happened. Tick, tock, each gear he cleaned, each spring he wound, felt like a ritual, a quiet reclaiming of dignity. But I saw the shift. He stopped whistling while he worked, stopped listening to the radio, stopped polishing the shop window, and one night after we closed, I saw him sitting in the back room, holding the same envelope he'd carried at the port, now folded, worn, and empty. I couldn't take it anymore. I opened my laptop, typed one phrase, Elder Financial Abuse South Carolina Legal Resources. What I found stopped me cold. Any transfer of funds under deceptive or coercive circumstances, particularly involving a senior citizen, may constitute financial exploitation under state law. It wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and called the one person I trusted who might understand, Annette Cross, retired judge, former customer, now a pro bono legal consultant for elder protection cases. She picked up on the second ring. Jake, been a while. I told her everything. The cruise, the check, the lie, the silence. She didn't interrupt, didn't gasp, she just said, "Bring him in tomorrow. Let's fix the clock legally." The next morning, we walked into her office, a brick building across from the courthouse, lined with ivy and an old brass plaque that read, "Cross and Counsel, Advocacy for the Forgotten." Annette looked at Grandpa and smiled gently. "Mr. Haynes, I used to bring you my broken watches. Now it's time I helped repair something for you." He chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't want trouble," he said. "They're still my children." Annette nodded. "And you're still a citizen with rights." And what they did isn't just disappointing, it's criminal. She laid out the process: financial exploitation complaint, subpoena for the travel agency, bank transaction tracing, potential civil recovery, and inheritance freeze. Then she looked at him directly. But I won't move forward unless you say yes. Grandpa looked at me, just one glance, and for the first time since the dock, his voice had weighed again. All right, let's wind the gears. That afternoon, back at the shop, I saw him clean the display case. He hadn't touched it in months. And when he finished, he pulled out a pocket watch, his father's, and set the time. Then he said quietly, "They stole 2 weeks from me, but I've got time left, and this time it's mine." Justice doesn't arrive like thunder. It ticks. Quietly, precisely. Just like the watches my grandfather used to fix. Annette Cross wasn't flashy. She didn't wear a power suit or speak in legal jargon for effect. She wore a cardigan with frayed cuffs and glasses that slid down her nose. But her mind, sharp enough to dissect a family's manipulation with 3 questions and a pot of black coffee. Our first stop was the bank. Sharon, the branch manager, had known Grandpa for over 30 years. She went pale when we explained what happened. She pulled the statement with shaking hands. 1 check, dated 3 days before the cruise. Payable to Whitmore Family Holdings, LLC. Amount, $25,000. Memo line, trip deposit. It was filed as a business contribution, Sharon whispered. They said it was a family investment vehicle. Annette nodded. That's fraud by misrepresentation. She made Sharon print 3 copies, stamped and signed. Next, the travel agency. They hesitated at first, said it was confidential. Until Annette presented the elder exploitation clause under state law. Then everything changed. The booking form showed 4 luxury staterooms, 6 names, 1 missing, Walter Haynes. But the payment came from him, the agent admitted. We assumed he'd be on the list. He wasn't, Annette said, and they knew it. Last stop, the port. Marina Terminal C, we found the check-in clerk, young, red braids, name tag, Tony. She remembered Grandpa. Said he looked excited, but kind of left behind. When asked why he didn't board, she lowered her voice. His son said he was a liability for international travel. Said the family made a last-minute call to exclude him. Her words were clipped. Angry. Did you document that? Annette asked. I didn't have to. We record everything. Security cameras and terminal audio logs. She paused. I'll testify if needed. What they did didn't feel right. Back at the shop, I sorted documents as Grandpa brewed tea. He moved more slowly than before. But with clarity, he didn't ask what Annette would do next. He just said, if it helps another old man stay off the shelf, let's keep going. Annette filed the civil complaint the next morning. She requested 3 actions. 1 immediate injunction to freeze any further transactions from Grandpa's accounts. 2, petition to recover funds through fraudulent transfer. 3, inheritance suspension request, citing breach of fiduciary and familial trust. It was bold, it was direct, it was just, and it was working. 3 days later, Annette called me while I was fixing a broken mantel clock. They're returning, she said. Cruise docks this Saturday, gate A6. I looked at Grandpa, polishing a second-hand stopwatch. Do you want to go? I asked. He didn't look up, just smiled faintly and said, let S be punctual. Saturday came like a storm in slow motion. No thunder, just the quiet certainty. That someone was about to be very uncomfortable. I arrived at gate A6 early. Grandpa stayed home, trimming the azaleas like it was just another Saturday. I told him I had errands. He handed me a grocery list: milk, tea bags, and the good marmalade. He didn't need to say more. We both knew I wouldn't be going to the store. Annette stood beside me, dressed in charcoal gray, not a lawyer's blazer, but something firmer, a presence. She held a manila folder tucked under one arm, the kind that didn't make noise, but always made an impact. Inside were three things: a notarized subpoena for civil financial exploitation, proof of deceptive transfer, a judge-approved freeze on inheritance disbursement, pending hearing. The ship docked at 8:02 a.m. At 8:17, they emerged. My father first, tan and grinning, pulling two luxury suitcases. Mom followed in new designer sunglasses. My sister had a shopping tote that read, "Paris is always a good idea." They laughed until they saw me. And then they stopped, laughter dead in their throats, like the ship had dropped anchor in their lungs. "Jake," my father said. I stepped forward, Annette beside me. "Charles Whitmore," she said firmly, "and Jennifer Whitmore." She turned slightly. "Ms. Melissa Whitmore as well." She handed each a document. My mother blinked. "What is this?" "Notice of civil action," Annette replied. "For the fraudulent acquisition of funds from a vulnerable adult, Walter Haynes, under false pretenses, resulting in emotional, financial, and reputational harm." My father scoffed. "This is absurd. He gave us that money willingly." Annette didn't flinch. "Under the assumption that he would be part of the trip. He was not. You accepted his money, excluded him, and misrepresented your intent." My sister rolled her eyes. "This is some kind of vendetta. You've always hated us, Jake." I looked at her, calm, measured. "I loved Grandpa more than you feared being exposed. That's the difference." My father stepped closer, voice low. "You're suing your own blood." "No," I said, "I'm defending it." He stared at me, for the first time in my life. He looked small, not because I was taller, but because I was standing somewhere he didn't know how to reach, on principle. Annette ended the conversation with precision. "You have 7 business days to respond. Noncompliance will result in a default judgment and potential criminal referral." She turned, I followed, but before I walked away, I looked back once, just once, their faces. No longer smug, no longer polished, just stripped bare, like someone had stolen their script. Good, because the show was over, and now we were back in real time. The ruling came 2 weeks later. Default judgment, full restitution, all $25,000 returned, plus damages, but the money wasn't the point. It never was. The court also approved the inheritance freeze, pending permanent removal. Annette filed the paperwork the same afternoon. And that night, over chamomile tea and cinnamon toast, Grandpa said something I'll never forget. "I'm not doing this out of spite, Jake. I'm doing it so no one like me has to sit at a dock again and wonder if they still matter." 2 days later, he met with his estate attorney and rewrote everything. My father, my mother, my sister. All removed, no conditions. No apologies accepted. He handed me a signed document and said, "If anyone asks what my legacy is, tell them it was this. I stopped the cycle." We didn't talk much about it after that, because there was life to live. He returned to his clocks, even taught me how to fix one. A battered Seiko from 1974. I got it ticking again, he smiled. "See, every second counts." A year later he passed, peacefully, in his sleep, wrapped in the same quilt my grandmother made, before she died decades earlier. We buried him in the back lot of the church he once volunteered at. Not in a suit, but in his workshop apron. His favorite pocket watch in his breast pocket. On the headstone, I carved the words he once told me at the bench: "Fix what matters." I turned the shop into something new, still called Haynes Timepieces. But now, under the sign, a smaller one hangs. And advocacy for elders left behind. We repair clocks. We fight for those who have been used, silenced, erased. Sometimes I catch myself talking to him, especially late at night when the room is filled with ticking, like echoes, like reminders. Every spring, I plant azaleas out front. He loved those. And every fall, I host a free legal clinic with Annette. For anyone over 60, we call it the Watchmaker's Hour. And on quiet days, when the sunlight hits just right, I sit at the front desk, look up at the framed photo of him above the register, and say, "You didn't just raise a family, Grandpa. You built a standard, and I'll keep time by it. Always."